At the dawn of the 20th century, immigrants flocked to the shores of America. Fleeing the economic and political hardships that plagued a weary Europe, they came seeking better lives for themselves and their families. Even in the midst of a Great Depression, these newly arrived citizens embraced their adopted land. The promise of America, the idea that anyone, regardless of class or circumstance, could rise to prosperity through ingenuity and determination, was an ever-present beacon of hope for themselves and for their children. It was the next generation, bred with old world values, but born and educated as Americans, who would truly build upon the foundations of liberty and opportunity. And while many of the children of immigrants found success, a few exceeded all expectations, even to the point of adding new threads to the hardy fabric of American free enterprise. One of these is Albert J. Amatuzio. Al took a proven technology, synthetic lubrication, and applied it in an entirely unique way. And from this one revolutionary idea, a new company was born. Countless lives have been enriched, and an entire industry has been transformed. But Al Amatuzio's road has been a long and undulating climb. His path arcs from a hardscrabble immigrant neighborhood to the fringes of Earth's atmosphere, and finally, to the boardroom of a global manufacturing and distribution enterprise. He has faced hardship, skepticism, and crisis, and met every challenge with a trademark blend of dogged determination and tireless optimism.
A lot of people would have been content with being a lieutenant colonel in the Minnesota Air National Guard and a pilot who competed with the best in all of the military.
But he had a dream. And it is rare to find someone with a dream like that, fighting all the odds.
He was being resisted by everybody and everything.
And you don't tell Al you can't do it. You just don't tell him that.
Al had tremendous faith in the fact that synthetic oil was eventually going to become a very big factor in the marketplace.
And it's only because of Al Amatuzio that the industry has grown like it is.
That's the American dream. You know, you start from scratch and you build up a company. I think it's amazing.
Al Amatuzio's story is one of vision and resolve, challenge and patriotism, innovation, and, in the end, realization of the dream that caused so many to seek new and distant shores.
It was a rough and tumble neighborhood, and those families that grew up down there, they knew how to fight and play and probably do a few things under the table and a little gambling and a little booze, and it had strong old country influences. They were sort of proud of it, actually.
Definitely, there was a pride in your ethnic background, your ethnic heritage. And that was one of the things that I think helped meld the community together. The people understood that somebody, the next house or two houses away, was a different ethnic group. And you learned to appreciate and, if not understand them totally, you knew that they came from a different background. And the people learned to get along with each other.
They would share and exchange vegetables out of their gardens, for example. They all knew the parents, the grandparents, the kids, and they kind of, in some respect, maybe even looked out for each other.
Far from Duluth, Minnesota's East End mansions and hillside thoroughfares, the Raleigh Street neighborhood developed along the muddy fringes of the city's industrial harbor. Here, during the early to mid-1900s, Poor Italian, Serbian, and Austrian families lived together in a safe and cooperative community that was in sharp contrast to the neighborhood's dangerous reputation. In fact, it was because of Raleigh Street's collective poverty that bedrock American values prevailed.
I think the big word that describes it is the close-knit families that grew up in hardship and became very, very close, had very, very high expectations for their children.
They worked around the steel plant, that worked in the foundries down there, and they weren't used to just things handed to them. They worked. And I think that carried through with a lot of those people down there.
They were immigrants, and because the people of long standing in the community kind of looked down their nose at them, they got the menial jobs. But their offspring then progressed through the education system and worked themselves into a better standard of living.
In the early 1920s, one of the families living in the Raleigh Street neighborhood was headed by Albert and Margaret Amatuzio. The young couple shared a strong Italian heritage.
Our mother and dad both migrated from Italy. My dad, I'm told, arrived in Duluth when he was 4 years old, my mother when she was 6 years old. And they met because they were neighbors.
In May of 1924, Margaret Amatuzio gave birth to her fourth child and second son. From the moment he entered the world, it was clear that challenge would be part of this child's experience.
He was born in a home there with a midwife and a neighbor lady were there. When he was born, he came out and he wasn't breathing. And the midwife worked on him, and there was no life, and worked on him and gave up, thought he was not going to make it, and he was dead.
And his neighbor lady, Mrs. Puglisi, said, she wouldn't take that for an answer, and so she worked on him and put him in cold water and warm water and lifted him up and down and whatever, and he said that her reward was that he wept all over the front of her, and when the doctor saw that, he thought, my goodness, this baby is alive.
Like his father, the boy was named Albert. But rather than call him Junior, his family adopted an even more descriptive nickname.
He was supposedly was going to be the last member of the family, and because he was called Babe.
He was Babe to me till I was about 12 or 13, and then I started hearing him mentioned as Albert. And I'm thinking, who the heck is this Albert? Is that a member of the Amatuzio family that I wasn't even aware of? His real given name is Albert, but he was always Babe.
From the beginning, young Al was filled with seemingly inexhaustible energy and constantly sought to expand the boundaries that defined his world.
He tells a story that my grandmother used to have to tie him to the sewing machine so that she could keep an eye on him, otherwise he would run off and never know what kind of trouble he would get into. He was very mischievous.
He took a tire and he rolled it all the way up the stairs to the top floor of where they lived, and he let it go. Crash! And the neighbors would come and they'd say, Margaret, your son, Albert. And he'd say, no, Mama, not me. It wasn't me, Mom.
Raleigh Street was the perfect anvil for forging a young boy's character. On the rough and tumble streets, Al developed a scrappy and resourceful persona. But the camaraderie and family values that governed the close-knit neighborhood also cultivated loyalty and respect.
It was a neighborhood where you had to learn to, in the education system, accept what the teachers, what the educators put forth to you and accept their discipline. Because if you didn't accept their discipline, and word got home that you didn't accept the discipline in the schools, you got the discipline at home.
My mother was the one that made us respect, demanded respect, that we respect our elders, that we respect everybody. And my dad would back my mother up completely.
Al's father, Albert Sr., had a compact but formidable frame. 5'9", 190 pounds, with a 17-inch neck, 45-inch chest, and 30-inch waist. Once, while playfully wrestling a much larger co-worker, he accidentally crushed 6 of the man's ribs. Throughout all of West Duluth, his strength was the stuff of legend.
He had this brute strength, and this is something that was born, it was in his genes. And people didn't mess with him because, he could take down 2 or 3 people at a time.
He worked at the inland coal dock as a foreman or assistant foreman, and when he would go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, he would walk over the railroad tracks to get to work, and he knew the men that were working at the railroad tracks, and they would have these large rails to move, and they couldn't move these rails, and they would wait for him to come in the morning. And when he would come down with his lunch pail, they would say, "Al, would you help us move this rail?" So he would tell the 4 or 5 of them to go at one end, he would get at the other end, and they would lift this rail up and move it to where they wanted. This was the strength he had.
In spite of Albert Sr.'s imposing physical prowess and being the family breadwinner, there was never any doubt that the Amatuzio household was a matriarchy. Whether meting out discipline to the children or setting the course for their collective future, the firm hand on the family tiller belonged to Margaret, also known as Marge.
She was a very determined woman that she was not only going to succeed, but her kids were going to.
A strong person. Marge was very well read. She loved to read. She would read books. She'd read all the time.
God, she could tell you presidents. She could name every one of them, back from the first one all the way. And she says, "You want me to do it forward or backward?" She could tell you that. Just amazing woman.
To the chagrin of his mother and father, local doctors and hospitals developed a regular familiarity with the spirited young Al. He seemed determined to do everything fast and to the limit, even if it meant a few broken bones. And so one day, when he suddenly stopped moving altogether, it could only mean that something was seriously wrong.
He was at a movie, and his brother Don, his older brother Don, was sitting in front of him. And the movie was over with, and it was time to go, and Al couldn't get up out of his seat. And so his brother carried him home. They didn't know what was wrong with him, and so his mother called the doctor.
And the doctor came over to the house, as Al tells the story, and he said, "He's not going to make it. He's not going to make it." And she says, "The heck, and she got a hold of the cab driver that was out there, and they threw a cab driver, picked up Al and threw in the cab and brought him out, got him to the hospital."
And Al said he remembers the cab driver carrying him into the hospital and putting him on the gurney that was there, and then he blacked out.
Al had developed rheumatic fever, a potentially life-threatening illness. Months in the hospital followed. Luckily, the disease never affected his heart or kidneys. Nor did it dampen his indomitable spirit. By the time he reached adolescence, an innate entrepreneurial drive was already in full gear. In the beginning, however, it was an enthusiasm fueled by necessity.
He always needed money, and he would pull many angles to get his hands on a couple of coins. He was quite an entrepreneur from that point of view. Not that it was in a malicious sense, but in a sense of trying to go out and have a good time and have some fun. He was really a very fun-loving young man who just loved being with people.
As a budding capitalist, Al also recognized the potential in America's growing love affair with the automobile, a portent of his future.
When he was a young boy, he tells a story about watching the cars go over the Arrowhead Bridge.
And he thought to himself, if I could only make a nickel, on each car that went by, I could be rich someday.
In 1940, Al Sr. developed trouble swallowing. A visit to the Mayo Clinic revealed cancer of the esophagus. It was inoperable. By this time, the Amatuzio's eldest son, Donald, was enrolled in medical school, an ambition his parents insisted he continue to pursue. This meant that when his father finally succumbed to the disease, Al Jr. became the oldest male living at home.
My dad really became the man of the house. He went and collected bottles for pennies for extra money. He collected coal off the side of the railroad tracks to heat the home, and he took on a lot of responsibility at a young age. You know, he may have lost a lot of his childhood, you know, which a lot of kids did, I think, back during the Depression.
Under Margaret's able direction, the entire family rose to meet the challenge.
Marge was a matriarch of that family. Al's father died when Al was 16, and she just rallied. I mean, the whole family rallied, and they had some pretty hard times, and she was the one that kept everything together.
She started a beer tavern, as a matter of fact, down in West Duluth to support the family.
Downstairs of the tavern, there was a bowling alley and a small pool hall. There were 3 pool tables down there. And myself and some of the younger kids in the neighborhood, we set pins. You had to set them in by hand, none of this automated stuff, and sit on the edge of the pit when the ball came smashing down and watch your legs so they wouldn't get hit. And she would always say, "Dear, you be careful you don't get hit by a pin," and things like that. Okay, Margaret, okay, Margaret.
By parlaying her resources, Margaret eventually purchased the Gitchinadji Supper Club in nearby Superior, Wisconsin. Throughout each venture, Al worked side by side with his mother as she labored to keep the family afloat.
At the Gitchinadji Club, I'm sure that he was very active in running the club with his mother. He was very close to her.
He was close to his mother until she died. She was just very, very close to him, and he to her. And I think you find a lot of very successful men were brought up by their mothers. Their fathers died at an early age and whatever. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems like it is.
Do you know that General Douglas MacArthur, his mother came and lived with him near West Point? Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a very, very dominating mother that was just into him and his idol, and I think mothers can make a tremendous contribution.
Margaret, for example, I think passed on her traditions of hard work and honesty and a little bit of stubbornness, although I don't think anybody will say that Babe Amatuzio is stubborn. I say that with tongue in cheek.
Our dad was an extremely patriotic person. He always felt that we owed this country everything. We were fortunate to be here. We're fortunate for what we have.
Like so many sons of immigrant families, Al Amatuzio was eager to answer America's call during the Second World War. Al graduated from Duluth's Denfeld Senior High School in 1942, only 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. His school yearbook listed his future ambition as oil engineer, but any aspirations other than military service were on hold. Prompted by a long-time fascination with flying, Al enlisted in the Naval Air Corps as a trainee pilot. But after months of study, the Navy decided they had enough pilots, and Al was released from the program. It was a bitter disappointment to a young man determined to serve his country.
He was still eager to get back into service, and he and his friend Anthony Rico joined the Merchant Marine, which he thought would be more another way that he could serve his country.
Those Merchant Marine ships were unarmed, and they were always watching out for torpedoes. In fact, more Merchant Marine ships were sunk than the naval ships were.
In fact, 1 in 26 mariners serving aboard merchant ships during the war died in the line of duty, a greater percentage than all the other U.S. services. By ferrying troops and supplies, Al and his fellow mariners made a vital and courageous contribution to the war effort, even as the scope of their sacrifice was suppressed to discourage the enemy. When the war ended, Al attended to unfinished business. His brief stint as a naval aviator had ignited a passion and an ambition he was determined to fulfill. He resolved to earn his pilot's wings, this time with the Air Force.
Back then, of course, flying was fairly new. This was a new thing. There was a mystique about it. There was pilots had a certain level of recognition and respect.
I don't think he could have been satisfied with any sort of mundane, any sort of other job. He needed more. That was his mind, you know.
And he's actually pretty modest about flying, but hearing it from other people, he had the right stuff.
There are fighter pilots and there are pilots who fly fighters. Al was a fighter pilot. You had to have that instinct, that tenaciousness, that excellence, and he was very meticulous. He's very aggressive, but he's a good pilot, and that's what you measure a guy most by, and that can he fly, and Al could fly. And could he shoot? Al could shoot.
He was a good pilot, took a great deal of pride in how he flew the airplane, just like he did in how he dressed and talked and did everything. He just took a lot of pride in it.
The life of an Air Force fighter pilot was tailor-made to mesh with his natural drive and confidence. Like his father, Al was not a large man, but he was living proof that stature is less a factor of size than it is appearance and attitude.
I think one of the things that impressed me the most about Al, he was somewhat of a perfectionist.
He was real picky about everything being just right. And the guys used to ride him a little bit. He's ultra clean. His uniform was just sparkled all the time.
He always seemed bigger than life because he carried himself well. His shoulders were back, his chest was out, he had a nice trim waist, and his uniform always looked good. I mean, he walked in the room and his stature of size made no difference. He was as big as you wanted him to be.
By 1949, the Air Force was transitioning from prop fighters to jet aircraft. Stationed at Selfridge Air Force Base near Detroit, Michigan, Al helped usher in the new technology by flying the F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. He also piloted what was likely the first jet to touch down in his hometown of Duluth, where he made a memorable impression on the members of the local Air National Guard.
And he reflied the airplane, checked everything around. Then he went back to the tailpipe and rumpled up some newspapers, stuck them in the tailpipe. Took a lighter out, fired him up. Nice little burning going on back there. He crawls in the cockpit, has the power unit start up, cranks up the engine starts, blows the newspapers out. He says, "That's the way we start them." Well, that was just the showman in Al.
He excelled as an aviator. He truly excelled, far beyond what most of his, if not all of his other counterparts could do. There were very, very few people that were comparable to him when he was in the cockpit of a plane.
When he was flying, I think he had the most joy in life.
Yes, I do too.
Yeah.
Despite Al's love of flying and his great success as an Air Force pilot, his family came first. When his mother fell ill, Al returned home to help run the family business. He immediately joined Duluth's Air National Guard 179th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, where he flew the famous P-51 Mustang.
He talks about that plane with great admiration. Its speed, its agility, and it required skill to fly. It had a large prop and a big motor, and if you accelerated too fast, it would twist the plane.
I was the guy that checked him out in a P-51. That's That's something he'll always remember, and he did an excellent job. And I remember telling him when he landed that you've got to have flown this airplane before, because you flew it so well that all I can think of is that you flew it before. No, I never did, he said.
Al's jet experience proved invaluable when the 179th replaced their Mustangs with F-94 Starfires. Al repeatedly proved his mastery with the sophisticated aircraft, even when confronted with a jet pilot's worst nightmare. On a mission over a remote part of Minnesota, Al's engine flamed out. His wingman was suddenly flying alongside a plane with no power, no instruments, and no radio.
And so he's gliding, and I'm having a hard time staying with him. And so finally I got up alongside of him, and I'm trying to talk to him. I don't know if he's hearing me. And I got on the radio, and I got a hold of Sage people, and they checked. And the closest field was Bemidji. And the weather, he said, was 5,000 foot high overcast. And I said, well, we can, we'll go over there and start circling down. And that's what we did. And the young airman got on the radio and said, I made a mistake. It's 500 feet. And so I tried to get a hold of Al. I signaled and I said, if you can hear me, you better jump. Get out of that thing. It's 500 feet. Nothing, and we kept going. All of a sudden, it got really thick, and Al disappeared, and I'm screaming at him to jump out. And my heart was down in my belly, and I really felt bad. And I started back, and was taking directions from the radar guy. And he says, "Could you see a target below your right?" And I said, "No, I'm in the weather." And we pick up once in a while. No. Well, I got back to the field, and just as I was coming up, I hear Albert on the radio, and he'd just gotten his radio back. Well, he'd got it relit again, way low, and he didn't have many instruments. They hadn't come back up again, and he went on needle ball and airspeed and broke out at 500 feet. Found the Highway 2 and was following it back to Duluth. And he came in, and I was never so happy to hear a voice in my life.
Along with Al's cool head and superb flying skills, he was a natural leader who inspired the best in his fellow pilots. Eventually, Lieutenant Colonel Amatuzio, known as Ammo to his men, was promoted to squadron commander.
He would bring lieutenants in. He'd listen to us, captains. He always had a open ear, open mind. So he got a lot of input, and he trusted you.
He's a pretty smart guy, and he'd pay attention to a lot of detail, really good at looking at that and seeing it. And he could tell when somebody really knew their stuff, and he would try to get that person into the position where he could do the most good. Emma was a master at that.
He gave people confidence in themselves. He gave people, rather than just running everything to the top of it, I was a guy that would give you a rope, and then if the rope can come tight.
You can lead some people most of the time. Some people you got to kick in the rump once in a while. And if that was necessary, why, Al could do that. But overall, it wasn't necessary for Al because he could work with people. He worked very well with people. He understood people. He had an innate ability.